Akash Chougule joins me now. He is the Vice President of Americans for Prosperity. Akash, and a side note for we Beltway people, when I say to you spout run, what do you think happened?
When you say what?
Spout run.
Ooh, I don't know. That's a Virginia reference, Hugh? You tell me.
Yes, it is. It's a reference to the exit one takes when you miss the Roslyn exit on the George Washington Parkway. That's where I have been turning around since 1983. I have been absolutely, Spout Run and I are old friends. Akash, I want to begin with the polls. The IDB tip poll came out yesterday, the tracking poll, national poll. Donald Trump, 49%, Kamala Harris, 47%. I'm a little afraid of getting irrationally exuberant here because I want Donald Trump to win. But what do you think of the polling and specifically that number?
I think it's exactly what we expected all along. Even when President Biden was the nominee, and more so when Kamala Harris became the nominee, this was going to be a toss-up going into Election Day. Now, Hugh, you and I have talked about how these national polls end up being largely meaningless. This election is going to come down to 7 key swing states, just like the Senate is going to come down to a handful of key swing states, and they are going to be toss-up races. That old cliche about turning out your voters is ultimately what's going to make this election, a win or a loss for either side. I think that's more true this time around than it's been maybe in my lifetime, right? Where it is the ground game, knocking doors, making phone calls, turning out your voters, moving that tiny portion of swing voters that's going to determine this. So I think any level of exuberance or confidence at this point might be misplaced in favor of just focus here in the last couple of weeks.
So, Akash, yesterday we had over for dinner my son's father-in-law and mother-in-law and in-laws, and my son's mother-in-law voted early in North Carolina in a very long line that was all pro-Trump in Winston-Salem. I am curious, what are you finding out in your early GOTV efforts about who is turning out?
Yeah, so we're mostly focused on moving those last few voters, Hugh, the kind of undecideds, the middle, the low propensity, right-leaning voters, things like that. So it's less GOTV, but I think what we have heard over and over and over again is we've knocked 17 million doors this year, Hugh. And that's in races up and down the ballot, the Senate, the House, down ballot, state level races. But the same issues keep on resonating, which are the economy, inflation, and the border crisis. Those issues are dominating the discourse in the grassroots and among swing voters. I think that should bode well for Republicans. But again, as you and I have talked about, a lot of it comes down to the candidates' level of focus on those issues and the message that they're delivering about who and what is to blame and what the path is going forward. As we've discussed many times, it's big government policies, overspending, overregulation that's to blame for inflation, the border crisis. Obviously, this administration is to blame, but a path forward of controlling spending, keeping the tax cuts, getting the border out of, under control. If Republicans are talking about those issues in the last 2 weeks, they should hopefully be in good shape going into November.
Now, Akash, this morning the Washington Post has a story I want to read to you. The headline is, "Housing costs are rising everywhere, but especially in the swing states." Quote, "America's housing affordability crisis is weighing heavily on the nation's most sought-after voters in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, where home prices have risen 65% since 2019. Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. In those 3 states, more than 80% of the voters live in counties where housing costs surged faster than the national average, which was pretty doggone high between August 2019 and 2024, the Post found. Many swing states, particularly along the Sun Belt, experienced an influx of new residents during the pandemic, driving up demand for housing. At the same time, COVID-related challenges made it difficult to keep up with new construction. The burst of demand combined with constrained supply led to a rapid run-up in prices." Well, we should also mention about spending $7 trillion that put an incredible amount of demand, fluid demand, marginal demand on the market as well. But genuinely, a housing crisis in the swing states. Is that helping Trump?
I think it's hard to know. It's certainly adding to people's angst about inflation and cost of living. I think one of the things that article may have pointed out or other analysts mentioned is that housing isn't always mentioned as frequently as gas and groceries are mentioned. Those are obviously weekly expenses people are taking on versus housing is maybe a one-time thing or a monthly thing when it comes to rent. But I think it just adds to the narrative that life has become unaffordable for the middle class, for young people, for millennials. But I think two other things I would mention there, Hugh, that are to blame for increased housing costs, especially in these states. One is tariffs, right? Importing raw materials that it takes to build houses has become more expensive through the last 10 years, which the Biden administration obviously kept in place. The other is the demand because people are moving to those states, right? Why are people moving to Arizona, Texas, Florida, North Carolina? Because they have the environment that conservatives have put in place of low taxes, low regulation, their right to work states. People are flocking to these states, young people, working people, young families. Of course, that's going to drive up demand. But of course, I don't expect the Washington Post to make that point that people are fleeing Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, and California for these states because of the policy environment that exists in these red Sunbelt states.
So, Akash, I'm curious. I've told everyone repeatedly about americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. That's americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. We have 2 weeks to go. They can still use your help. Has that worked? Have new people come forward to say, I want to get involved in my community and I want to work for a not-for-profit that has a long history of effectively turning out the vote?
Oh yeah, absolutely. What we're seeing a lot of this year, he was people who would know us. They've known us for a long time. If you go back to, the Act 10 labor days in Wisconsin or the tax fights in North Carolina, we've been active in Florida for a long time. As people who have known us and trust us are coming back into the fold because they know that we give them the tools and the capability and the geo targeting, the data targeting, to make a difference with a limited amount of time that they have in their day. Right? People aren't all doing what you and I do here, where we talk about this stuff and work on it full time. They've got families and jobs and things like that. And so we're giving them a chance with a limited amount of time to make a difference for the conservative movement. And so we've seen a lot of urgency, a lot of activity. And we do believe, based on the data that we see, it is making a difference, really across the country in the states and communities that we're focusing on.
How do you feel the Senate looks right now? Because I do believe it's a lock that the Republicans are going to take the Senate. It's just a question of the margin. I'd like Dave McCormick and Bernie Moreno and Larry Hogan to win. I know that Tim Sheehy is going to win in Montana and Jim Justice in West Virginia, but I'd like Kerry Lake to win. I think Nella Domenici has a shot in New Mexico. I think Sam Brown has a shot in Nevada. There are others like Hung Kao in Virginia. What do you think, Akash?
Yeah, I think you're basically right. Republicans are in a good position to take the majority, but the size of that majority does matter, Hugh. And you mentioned Sam Brown, Dave McCormick, Bernie Moreno, Larry Hogan. These are great, great candidates who deserve to win. They're in tough races, but here's why that margin ultimately matters. If they're to extend the Trump tax cuts or build on them, as you know, that only takes a simple majority in the Senate, 50 votes. We'd much rather be in a position where we have 52, 53 votes. We're not just relying on what Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski will let get through the Senate. If we have a vote margin of 2, 3, even 4 vote majority in the Senate, that allows full Republican control to pass a much more conservative tax and reconciliation package that would obviously get through a Republican House, get signed by a Republican president. But the size of that Senate majority will make a big difference on how conservative the governance is in a full Republican control scenario. And that, as you mentioned, is something that activists and volunteers can help determine here in the next couple of weeks with AFP.
Uh, Akash, last question. Again, americansforprosperity.org/volunteer to get involved. Always the Republicans win and they sit around and do nothing for 3 months, sometimes 4 months, sometimes 5 months, because they're listening to everyone argue about what ought to be in the budget. That is such a waste of time. I mean, they ought to have a budget done and ready to pass in the first week and reconciliation follow-on bills to pass in weeks 2 and 3. Do you think they will get out of the blocks fast?
I do, and the reason I know that is because we have been directly involved in those conversations. Speaker Johnson, Majority Leader Scalise, the committees, they've been active, honestly, for months, Hugh, preparing for this exact scenario. We can't be in the situation we were in 2017, where healthcare kind of fell on our heads. They fumbled it for a while and then turned their attention to tax. And so Republican leadership has been very, very hands-on. And you mentioned the process exactly like that. They have to agree on a budget, pass that budget with instructions for the various committees and what have you, and then take the process from there. They have been not only involved in that conversation, but talking to the Senate, preparing for the various scenarios of the size of the majorities in the House and Senate. And so, yes, I expect there to be much better preparation and much better, faster activity in the first 100 days in a full Republican-controlled Congress. Again, you have to get there.
So the most important thing is getting that done early so that America has certainty about their tax structure for the next 5 years. That ignites investment and the recovery cycle from the Biden-Harris years. But first, we got to win. As Mitch McConnell says, first thing, you got to win. Akash, Chougule, good to talk to you. I'll be right back, America. Stay tuned to the Hugh Show.